Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today on this webinar. I'm excited to talk to you today about the role of institutional research and institutional researchers in promoting racial equity within the community college context. Now, before we get started, just a few logistical things. Everyone is muted during the talk so that we don't have feedback or random sound on our recording. The presentation will be available to you on YouTube via the Office of Community College Research and Leadership so that you could view at a later time or share with others. If you have any questions or need to make a comment, you can use the chat feature and we'll try to answer those quickly, but I ask that you keep those to kind of more technical questions. If you have more detailed questions, I'm happy to engage with you over email, and I'll offer my contact information at the end of the PowerPoint. So just before we get into it, just a little bit about me. My name is Elvira Abrica. I prefer Elvira, Spanish pronunciation, but Elvira, English pronunciation is also just fine. I currently work as an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the Department of Educational Administration. My scholarly and teaching emphasis is in higher education, so I teach and advise in our master's program and our PhD and EDD programs in educational leadership and higher education, as well as our community college leadership program. Before joining the faculty at UNL, I worked in institutional research and assessment for several years across both 4- and 2-year contexts. First, I worked at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, then Cal State University Fullerton, and finally within the Riverside Community College District, which is one of the fastest growing and largest community college districts in the state of California. My research principally examines the dynamics of race, ethnicity, culture, and power as they shape educational opportunity for diverse student populations. One strand of my work has focused broadly on the organizational structures of community colleges, including an emphasis on institutional research and assessment. Today's talk is called Pillars of Neutrality on Subjectivities of Institutional Research and Researchers. In this talk, I'm going to engage you in 2 broad questions, and I'm hoping that you'll continue to reflect on these questions long after this presentation, and that we can be thought partners in thinking about answers to these questions. So the first is, how is the current emphasis on racial equity within community colleges compatible with the socialization of IR professionals and the capacities of IR offices, especially within the community college context? Secondly, how might individuals within the IR context explicitly engage with issues of power, privilege, race, and racism in their work? Oops, I think I skipped that. There we go. Now, by way of definition, institutional research, when I say institutional research or IR, I'm referring to what are sometimes called offices of institutional effectiveness. These offices conduct evaluation, assessment, enrollment research, and/or help with planning on colleges and university campuses. They play an important role in shaping decision-making, policies, and practices, and they often shape the organizational context, campus climate, and culture of an institution. The work of IR professionals is shaped by external accountability demands and policy shifts that are ever-changing and quite complicated. And so the work that's done in IR is very much driven by these external forces. Unfortunately, equity and advocacy are not routinely part of IR work, and this is true especially for racial minority students. Accountability reporting or frameworks do not expressly require IR offices to report, assess, reassess, or respond to ongoing student inequities. And as Frank Harris and Estela Ben-Simon point out, this disconnect is problematic because if the academic outcomes of minority students are not regularly and assessed regularly and treated as measurable evidence of institutional performance, we can expect that inequalities in outcomes will remain structurally hidden and unattended to. So, fundamentally, a disconnect between the field of institutional research and equitable outcomes in post-secondary education reifies 2 implicit and problematic assumptions. 1, that IR is divorced from racial and ethnic disparities in student experiences and outcomes, and 2, that it's even possible to address historic inequities without critical examination of the cultures, policies, and practices embedded within all structures of U.S. higher education, including institutional research contexts. And so to address our first question around how compatible this focus on racial equity and IR socialization are, I turned to my own training and my own socialization in IR, and I started reading about how IR professionals are socialized. So we have this emphasis on racial equity within the community college, but I wanted to understand how kind of the classic seminal literature talks about IR socialization. And so for me, it seems like an inquiry into the interconnectedness of IR and issues of educational inequity really threaten the pillar of neutrality that's associated with IR. And so as SOP in 1990 wrote, institutional research, like other types of research, should be objective, systematic, and thorough. The outcomes of this research should be as free as possible from the influence of personal philosophy, political consideration, and desired results. The information provided by institutional research is combined with academic and professional judgment in planning and other decision-making processes, emphasis added. And so to me, there was a fundamental tension between the current emphasis on racial equity and this classic seminal IR socialization literature, most of which came from the 1990s. However, one exception to this is Patrick Terenzini's work. He wrote in the 90s, but also updated his framework in 2013. And he offers a whole schema of how we might think about the different competencies and skill sets that IR professionals need to have in the field. And so in 2013, he offered a revised framework describing the competencies of IR professionals. And in the revised version, he focused on how the originally conceived competencies looked in light of broader changes within the higher education environment, such as increased globalization, student diversity, and technological advancements. And so he talks about what he calls issues intelligences. And he says this form of organizational intelligence includes knowledge of the kinds of issues and decisions that middle and upper level administrators in functional units face. And this means understanding how colleges and universities function with regard to an institution's political dimensions and the formal and informal dynamics of power. So that even though he's talking about dynamics of power on campus and how administrators need to be attuned to these issues, and they need to have issues intelligences and competencies, what he calls organizational intelligence, this does not include, for Terenzini, a focus on race. And so I think the question is open as to how institutional leaders do this, specifically to advance racial equity. So further, he talks about how IR professionals need to know how to, quote, play the game. They need to know how to navigate the politics of a campus environment. And political savvy IR professionals, according to this framework, will be most successful in securing access to resources and finding common ground with individuals representing multiple constituencies on campus. He says specifically, IR professionals need a keen understanding of the people in the college and university setting, what faculty, administrators, staff, students, and others value, what's important to them. It is the ability to anticipate how others will respond to a proposal and the idea or opportunity or threat, and whether the reactions will be positive, neutral, or negative. IR is knowing what it takes to secure others' support. And so he emphasizes how the IR professional needs to have this form of competency. They need to have this form of intelligence and skill set to be successful. And so the question that I sort of pose in my own work is around how that happens. How does being responsive to a constituency limit one's ability to advance racial equity within the community college? And so the way that I did this as an IR professional, I write about in an article called Chicanas in IR, Data-Driven Advocacy for Latinx Students from Institutional Research Context in the Community College. And in this piece, my co-author and I employ what's called a testimonial. Testimonials come from the critical race theory methodological tradition, and they allow an individual to center their lived experience in order to offer an argument or offer evidence of a particular phenomena. And so in our case, we use testimonials to critique the pillar of neutrality associated with the institutional research profession and argued for a critical examination of the ways in which IR may play an active role in the perpetuation or the dismantling of educational inequities. And so we describe some of the challenges that we faced from working as IR people, and we offer testimonial as one way to do that. And so I don't have the answer to the question of how incompatible it is to be socialized according to the traditional canon per Terenzini and to advance racial equity. But in this paper, we kind of talk about how some of those challenges came about with us and our socialization. The second question that I want to engage with you today around is how to engage power, privilege, race, and racism in IR work. So essentially, one way in a recent issue of the journal New Directions for Institutional Research, there was a special issue that talked about qualitative approaches in institutional research. And so there's somewhat of a movement toward relying on qualitative approaches in IR. And this makes sense because institutional researchers already rely on a variety of methodological approaches to generate information that can be used to guide institutional improvement and practice. And so there's been more push to incorporate more qualitative approaches in IR and assessment. However, my premise is this: the dynamics of power and privilege inherent in the use of any methodological approach are noticeably absent around discussions of the use of different approaches within institutional research and assessment. For example, it's somewhat unclear the answers to the following questions. How do qualitative studies fit into routine IR activities that typically include accreditation, enrollment management, academic program review, evaluation, self-study, and others? What does this look like in terms of practical execution, time allocation, resources? If an office only has 2 people working in it, how does one advance racial equity vis-a-vis these more nuanced qualitative approaches when there's just not the capacity to do so? And then how might qualitative evidence be weighed, ultimately, valued and utilized by campus leaders and external constituencies? Again, thinking back to the competencies of being responsive to constituencies, how does qualitative data get leveraged there? And then do we assume that IR professionals trained to privilege quantitative approaches will be ready to embrace a constructivist interpretation of reality, for example? Finally, how might IR professionals transition, say, between the epistemological and ontological assumptions of qualitative and quantitative paradigms? And so these questions are largely unanswered, and I don't know that I have the answers to them. But I do think that there's one tool specifically that we can draw on, which is called reflexivity. Researcher reflexivity is a common qualitative practice, and it's a specific tool that IR professionals endeavoring to conduct any type of research, but particularly qualitative research studies involving students of color, can use to unpack issues of power and privilege that exist between the researcher and the researched. The researcher is the instrument of data collection and analysis, so it's critical that IR professionals consider the ways that their subjective experiences shape their interpretation of participants and their realities. So reflexivity is one way that researchers can consider who they are in the world, their perspectives, their beliefs, their ideas, and how those inform the research from its conceptualization to its analysis. And again, this may be applicable to a quantitative study, but is particularly useful for qualitative research, especially as more institutions are looking to do qualitative work, particularly with students of color. And so I offer here again another example from my own body of work an article in which I provide an example of how reflexivity helped me to understand my own identities and positionalities and how they inform my research on men of color within the community college context. So I encourage you to read that if you can. And so one of the things I'll say is that researchers need to not share the same racial or cultural background as their participants, but they must be engaged in thoughtful reflection, especially where race and culture are concerned. Otherwise, to not do so is dangerous. And those dangers could include inattention to racialized experiences, the development of policies and practice that can have deleterious consequences for students of color, or they can reinforce students of color as inherently deficient and unable to achieve success. So it's vital that at a minimum, IR offices discuss the fact that IR professionals who are predominantly white would be conducting studies involving populations that are increasingly non-white. And so I leave you with some concluding thoughts about IR socialization. Namely, I think we need to challenge presumptions of neutrality associated with the IR profession. We need to explicitly interrogate who works in IR and their capacities, competencies, and socialization toward engaging in equity work. Finally, we need to recognize that the call for equity-minded practitioners, which I think is often talked about in terms of staff or faculty in the community college context, should and does include IR professionals. And equity-mindedness, as Felix et al. Describe, requires that practitioners accept that higher education as an institution is racialized and that structural racism is produced by everyday practices that are grounded on norms and rules that ultimately privilege whites. Finally, concluding thoughts about how to interrogate race, power, and privilege within IR work. I think we can use a variety of approaches, including, but not limited to, qualitative approaches. We should consider reflexivity in both qualitative and quantitative approaches, although it seems more appropriate sometimes for qualitative work, as that's where it principally has developed as a concept. I think we need to develop a toolkit for what I call critical institutional research methods that may include qualitative approaches which interrogate rather than describe, question rather than report, and story rather than quantify observed racial disparities in transfer, degree completion, a certificate completion, and other outcomes within the community college. And so we're at time, and I want to just encourage you to stay in touch. I don't have all the answers, but I hope that we can remain thought partners in answering the two questions around the compatibility of racial equity endeavors and IR socialization, as well as how we can interrogate power, privilege, race, and racism in IR. And I thank you for spending the time. Just a shameless plug, if you have ideas about topics that you would like to see covered related to institutional research, I'm on the editorial board for the New Directions for Institutional Research Journal. And so I welcome you to email me, reach out to me or to the board if you have any ideas about things that you want to see covered related to institutional research. And so with that, I bid you a good day and thank you so much for watching.